Hello everyone, and welcome to this webcast entitled Multiple Sclerosis and the World of Work. I'm Phil Rumrill. I'm a professor of rehabilitation counseling and director of the Center for Disability Studies at Kent State University in Ohio. I'm glad to be here in sunny Richmond, Virginia, and delighted to take part in this webcast series sponsored by the Virginia Commonwealth University Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. So I want to thank the folks here at VCU for having me in town today. I also want to acknowledge the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, who has been a generous sponsor of our research on MS and employment over the years, and much of the information that I share with you today has resulted from research that we conducted that was sponsored by grants from the National MS Society. Begin with a brief overview of multiple sclerosis. We know that MS, multiple sclerosis or MS is one of the most common neurological disorders in the world. It is characterized by lesions that occur in the central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord. And what happens with MS is that the immune system destroys the myelin sheath, or the insulation that covers nerve tissue in the brain and along the spinal cord. And the resulting lesions that happen from this break in the insulation slow or block the conduction of electrical impulses from the brain to the rest of the body via the spinal cord. And the symptoms of MS, which are many and varied, are determined chiefly by the size and location of those lesions. There are several aspects of MS that distinguish it from other chronic illnesses that I think are worth mentioning here. First is the onset of the disease typically occurs in early to middle adulthood. Between the ages of 20 and 40, most often, with the peak incidence of initial symptoms occurring at around age 30. Another is the unpredictable, chronic, and sometimes progressive disease process. For most people, MS is characterized by cycles of relapses and remissions, and then over time, a steady, sometimes a very precipitous decline in overall health status. But the unpredictable nature of the disease creates a unique impact on psychological functioning, social relationships and roles, and employment. The other thing that makes MS unique is the high incidence among women. 3/4 of all people with MS worldwide are women. MS is not a terminal disease per se. In fact, people with MS experience generally normal life expectancies, another thing that distinguishes it from other illnesses. As we will also talk about here today, MS seems to have a very significant impact on employment and career development that makes it different from other illnesses as well. Another feature of MS that distinguishes it from other chronic illnesses is the presence of cognitive impairment. And these can be very frustrating and significantly intrude upon functioning in a number of life activities. And so the cognitive issues that people with MS face are a big part of what happens in the employment issues that they deal with as time and the illness progress. Moving along, some history and risk factors about multiple sclerosis. Clinical observations of MS date back to the 14th century, although it was really in the latter part of the 19th century when the term multiple sclerosis began to show up in clinical records. So it's been around for a long time. We know that there are about 450,000 people with MS in the United States, and about 2.3 million folks with MS across the globe. I mentioned that MS is most common among women, also predominates among people of European lineage, Caucasians, although there are growing numbers of, in the United States, of African Americans and Latinos who are being diagnosed with the disease. The cause of MS is thought to be a combination of genetic, environmental, and autoimmune factors. That your genetic composition provides a susceptibility to MS, but that some environmental event that puts a stress or tax on the immune system then occurs and causes it to direct itself toward the myelin sheath, as I had talked about earlier. MS can produce a wide range of symptoms, and again, keeping in mind that the symptoms of MS can vary. They tend to kind of come and go, but because the impairment happens in the brain and along the spinal cord, it can affect just about every aspect of personal and social functioning. So we have a list of frequently occurring symptoms, by far the most common of which is fatigue. But you also see a wide range of mobility impairment, spasticity, numbness and tingling, particularly in the extremities, visual impairments, cognitive impairment, as I mentioned earlier, sexual dysfunction, bowel and bladder functioning can be affected as well, diminished strength, chronic pain, affective disorders, very common for people with MS to experience depression and anxiety. In fact, people with MS are about 3 times more likely than the general population to experience those psychological disorders. Bipolar disorder, a fairly common effect of MS, and with the affective responses to MS, it's important, I think, to point out that we're not entirely sure how much of those affective responses are due to organic changes that occur in the brain in the areas that affect one's mood and emotions, or whether these are simply adjustmental responses to having a condition that is very frustrating and very difficult to deal with. So you can see the wide range of symptoms and the effects that MS can have really across functional areas. And so therefore, with this wide range of symptoms and the unpredictable and sometimes progressive disease course, it should come as little, it should be of little surprise that MS has a significant impact on people's prospects for employment after diagnosis. In terms of the employment issues facing people with MS, we know that the majority of people with multiple sclerosis are unemployed 5 years after diagnosis. The labor force participation rate for people with MS ranges between 30 and 45%, depending on the study. And the most recent estimates are that 59 or between 59 and 60% of people with MS worldwide are not employed for pay. A study we did several years ago, funded by the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, revealed that 98% of the participants had employment histories. That means they'd worked at some point in the past. And in fact, 82% of respondents were still working at the time they were diagnosed with MS. This shouldn't be too surprising given that the peak incidence of initial symptoms occurs at around age 30. So most people have had the opportunity to receive training and establish their careers by that time. More specifically, 98% of respondents in this sample, and this was more than 2,000 people with MS in a nationwide survey, 98% were high school graduates and 46% held 4-year college degrees. So this is an experienced, well-trained, and well-educated and productive group of workers. And so their mass exodus from the workforce that occurs fairly soon after diagnosis, only 40% of this particular sample were employed at the time of the survey, really deprives society of a very important labor force among this talented, productive, and yet far too often disenfranchised group of workers. In another study we did, we asked unemployed people with MS to talk to us about their experiences with employment. Interestingly, we found that 75% of unemployed people with MS leave their jobs voluntarily. They make the choice to disengage from the workforce. And that 4/5 of unemployed people with MS, so just around 80%, believe that they still have the ability to work. And in fact, 3/4 of that same group of unemployed folks with MS say that they would like to work. So when you funnel these statistics down, what you have is a profile of experienced, productive, and talented workers who exit the workforce, usually in the first 5 years after diagnosis, most often of their own choosing, before the condition has rendered them incapable of working by their own report, right? Because 80% feel they still can work. And then they end up regretting that decision because 3/4 of them would like to return to the workforce, even as they deal with MS and return to work using on-the-job accommodations and other supports to help them retain employment. So we find these folks disengaging from the workforce in really wholesale fashion prematurely from their own reports and then wanting to go back into the workforce. So part of what we try to do in interventions related to MS and employment is to keep as many of those productive workers on the job as long as possible. So preventing job loss, job retention interventions become a much greater focus early in the disease process rather than waiting till people have disengaged from the labor force and trying to help them regain employment. That can still be done, but it's much easier to help someone keep a job than it is to help them find another one entirely. Over the years, we and several other and many other researchers have done studies looking at the factors that determine the likelihood that someone with MS will maintain employment over time, even after diagnosis. And we've learned from these studies that women are more likely than men to disengage from the workforce following diagnosis. We know that people with higher socioeconomic status in higher status occupations or people with higher levels of education are more likely also to continue in employment. We know that older workers are more likely to disengage from the workforce than are younger ones with MS, and that over time, as age and health issues are related, that people tend with MS, people with MS who are younger tend to be employed at a higher rate than people with MS who are older. That's sort of the simple explanation for that, and it's probably explained mostly by the fact that over time people's symptoms become more severe and they encounter other health-related issues that they have to attend to. We know that the type of symptoms people experience can have a bearing on whether they retain employment. Cognitive impairment is the single strongest symptom-related predictor of employment status. A person with MS who has cognitive impairment as part of his or her disease process is 4 to 6 times more likely to be unemployed than a person with MS who does not have cognitive impairment. So this becomes a big issue in terms of workplace accommodations and other supports for folks with MS is the cognitive functioning. People with more progressive forms of the disease are more likely to disengage from the workforce. That shouldn't be any surprise. People whose jobs require physical exertion or require them to work out of doors because of the mobility and physiological and physical effects of MS, also more likely to disengage from employment than people who work under other occupational conditions. We also know that employer and coworker attitudes have a major bearing on people's prospects for ongoing employment after diagnosis, and the presence of workplace discrimination, which is sort of the ultimate behavioral manifestation of negative attitudes on the part of employers. People with MS who experience discrimination in the workplace, and this is a significant problem by their own reports, tend to disengage from the workforce to a greater degree than people with MS who don't report that as part of their experience. Another approach that we've used in research related to employment of people with MS is quite simple. We simply ask people with MS what are their main employment-related concerns. Both people who are unemployed, people who are employed, what things are you thinking about, what considerations do you have to make in order to make the decision whether to continue working or not following diagnosis. And in numerous studies, and this sort of distills findings from our research over the years and the findings of our friends and colleagues who do similar work, we have found that repeatedly that people with MS talk to us about concerns related to benefits, particularly health insurance benefits and working conditions. They mentioned the importance of interactions with coworkers and supervisors as a concern. They're concerned about accessibility in the workplace, both physical accessibility and accessing their workstations and being able to perform the essential functions of their jobs, particularly those functions that require physical dexterity and/or cognitive skills. Getting back to that same issue on cognitive impairment becomes a major issue. The availability of workplace accommodations and assistive technology to help support people's job retention efforts. The availability of training and advancement opportunities. Keep in mind, people with MS are often diagnosed in the early to middle stages of career development, and so these issues become very important thinking about the remainder of their careers. They want information about, as I mentioned, workplace accommodations, and the most common form of workplace accommodations used by people with MS nationwide is actually schedule modifications. So the cost of those accommodations is usually fairly minimal. So schedule modifications, flexibility to work at home if that's an option, to telecommute when they're not feeling well, a rest period during the day to help to combat fatigue. These are the accommodations we see quite often. Use of assistive technology to support cognitive functioning is a growing area in the MS research and intervention world. The availability of vocational rehabilitation services that focus on job retention. Remember earlier we established that most people with MS are still working at the time of diagnosis, so there's a growing emphasis on early intervention to help people who are early in the disease process make considerations about their careers and continue working as long as they choose to do so. The issue of disclosure. What does the Americans with Disabilities Act require people to share about their disability status, about their MS status in this particular case? How do you go about requesting a reasonable accommodation? What if you've been subjected to unfair treatment, excuse me? How do you redress that? What are the avenues? How do you identify workplace discrimination and deal with it, an issue that folks with MS tell us over and over becomes very important. So understanding their legal rights, knowing what resources exist to help them in continuing their careers, and integrating symptom management procedures into their employment pursuits. So managing your symptoms, staying well as long as you can, being as healthy as possible, and thinking of work as a benefit to your health. We know that people who work are healthier, they're happier, they live longer, they've got greater social capital than people who don't. So we want to find ways to help this experienced and well-trained group of workers, most of whom want to continue working, to do exactly that. We still have a lot of work cut out for us owing to the 40% labor force participation rate that we keep seeing in these studies that we do. But there are a lot of resources that are available to help, and these are some of the main employment issues that rehabilitation professionals are likely to deal with in working with folks who have MS. In conclusion, I've posted a couple of resources that I would recommend. The National Multiple Sclerosis Society's website has a wide variety of excellent and up-to-date information about multiple sclerosis, medical aspects, psychosocial resources, employment-related information, a little bit of everything. And the Job Accommodation Network at West Virginia University is a great resource for information related to workplace accommodations and other matters related to the Americans with Disabilities Act and, in fact, other federal laws that provide protection for people with disabilities. With that, I'll conclude this program, and thank you for your time and attention.